Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Lama is a side character in the grander Star Wars story. He's a pretty typical Kaminoan, cold, calculating, and arrogant. The only thing that's really interesting about him at all was his position as Prime Minister of Kamino. You know, being a Prime Minister is an executive position in governance. That means you basically get to run an entire nation, or planet in this case. But being the Prime Minister of Kamino makes your job a little bit different. You see, the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic was a monumental task. I mean, cloning that many soldiers would have been a huge accomplishment for any major intergalactic corporation in the galaxy. And so for a single planet to achieve this amazing goal was also an incredible feat. I mean, the Kaminoans had to dedicate decades to the secrecy of this program, right? Like, they couldn't let anyone find out that the clone army existed. They even removed Kamino from any star charts, basically isolating the planet from the rest of the galaxy. And so if you were the Prime Minister of Kamino during this time, you were also technically in charge of the cloning program. It is one of the biggest revenue generators for your entire planet. It's incredibly important for the future of your people. And Lama, well, not only did he take great pride in his clone army, he saw it as one of the finest achievements in his people's history. And this was in no small part due to the fact that he helped set up the infrastructure to train the clones. Combat rooms, dorms, educational facilities, and everything else in between. Lama is basically a project manager given an infinite budget to create the perfect army. It's actually a pretty cool job. But here's the thing, like, Lama was just not a cool individual. You know, despite his pride in his clone army, or arrogance, he never really viewed the individual clones as more than a product that represented his greatness and the greatness of his people. Therefore, he never really cared about the welfare of the clones and what happened to them once they left his facilities. All he really cared about were the profits he was generating for Kamino. And when you have leaders with such an intense focus on the pursuit of profits, well, that might actually hurt the company's long-term growth potential and survivability. Kind of reminds me of Boeing. Kind of reminds me of how Boeing saved billions by screwing over their vendors, by forcing them to create components for such a low cost that it ultimately made their planes less safe. And instead of taking those savings and investing it into newer, better platforms, what did Boeing do? Stock buybacks. Wall Street is really killing everything. Anyway, Kaminoan Senator Halle Bertoni, great name, always had a finger on the pulse of the Republic. She was the one who leveraged Kamino's clone project into a seat in the Senate. I mean, most Outer Rim planets had been waiting for centuries, if not millennia, to be accepted into the Republic. And even when they were accepted, they usually didn't get direct representation, which is sort of what Kamino got. Usually you were just lumped in with your entire sector. And, you know, you could even hate your neighbors, maybe they're cannibals, but yeah, you're getting represented by the same individual. Now, Halle Bertoni was definitely a very capable politician, and she saw the writing on the wall far before Lama ever did.
Lama was arrogant, too confident. His clones were a necessity to the Empire.
And even when Lama realized that the Empire was investing credits into alternative soldier programs, he was still foolish enough to believe that he could save Kamino somehow by creating a better clone trooper program.
We must ensure our clones remain essential.
The original genetic material from Jango Fett continues to degrade.
I don't know if you guys remember this plot from the first season of The Bad Batch, but while the Empire was moving to make Kamino obsolete, instead of preparing his people for the end of the clone program, Lama was basically focused on a Hail Mary toss to find and capture Omega, an unaltered Jango Fett clone, in the hopes that her DNA could create the next generation of elite clones. He even hires Cad Bane to find Omega and bring her back. That could not have been cheap. And Nala Se then secretly hires Fennec Shan to make sure that never happens. The reality is, even if Lama is successful, you know, the next generation clone army is just not something the Empire was looking for. Simply put, there were so many destitute worlds full of young men and women looking for jobs. Turning those bodies into soldiers simply was cheaper and also decreased unrest in the remote regions of the galaxy. It was basically a win-win for the Empire. A political and economic solution all wrapped into one, and it basically was one of the ways they were hoping they could solve the Empire's greatest problems, which again is the Outer Rim. It's something that Lama never understood about the Empire. They didn't need elite soldiers, they just needed bodies. to fill in positions. They also needed to keep people busy so that they didn't notice they were being oppressed, and what better way to oppress the population than to turn one half of the population into prison guards. Now, there's something interesting about this conversation between Nala Se and Lama Su, and something that actually Lama Su talks about earlier on in the war.
I understand your concerns, Master Jedi. Ever since the unfortunate death of Jango Fett, we have had to stretch his DNA to produce more clones.
This conversation happens during the Clone Cadets arc, which is pretty early on in the war. And for Lama Su to, admit this to the Jedi, I guess that means it's not a big secret. I mean, Lama Su never really understood the Jedi and their compassion, but I guess he respected Shaak Ti as the main client for the Clone Trooper program. And perhaps it's Shaak Ti's honesty that brings out Lama Su's honesty about a major flaw in the clone army. Actually, this is a huge problem. When Jango Fett's head was removed from his body, thus ended the living donor for the Clone Trooper program. And I guess ever since then, the clones that were being made were of a lower quality. Now, Lama Su and Shaak Ti were having a conversation about Domino Squad, a unit of clone cadets that were struggling to pass their final test to become clone troopers. This would have been one of the earlier batches of clones made for the Clone Wars, but they weren't original generation like Captain Rex. Now, Lama Su's excuse for Domino Squad's poor performance is the degradation of the donor DNA after the death of Jango Fett. That's interesting because Jango Fett actually died at the outset of the war just a few years earlier. Domino Squad would have already been in their teenage years already, and so my understanding is that while the death of Jango Fett definitely posed huge problems for the Kaminoans, it seems like each generation of clones already suffered from poor genetic material. This could be due to the age of the donor. Jango Fett was aging, obviously, or it could be some other factor in how the DNA is being taken or stored. And knowing everything we know about Lama Su, it's pretty clear he's telling the truth here, and he's just looking at the data and telling Shaak Ti what he sees. Which brings up something I never really thought about, but it's very possible that each generation of clones is worse than the previous one. Now, the problem here is worse is kind of a loaded term. Is worse from Lama Su's point of view, because that would mean the clones lack some attributes that were more favored by the Kaminoans, like increased loyalty and compliance. But worse could also mean the Bad Batchers. These clones were heavily mutated by Nala Se, who was kind of a savant of sorts. She turned genetic mutations that might have been perceived as undesirable by bureaucrats like Lama Su into something truly advantageous. As a geneticist, Nala Se is almost like an artist who's moved beyond realism and ventured into the realm of abstraction. And the result of her finest work of art, the Bad Batch, is far superior to the regular clones. Each Bad Batch member almost has a superpower of their own. Now, obviously, the Bad Batch could never be scaled up much larger than a 4-man commando unit, and it would never fit the needs of either the Empire or the Republic, which needed not just special force units, but an entire army of clones, including logistics and support staff, regular line infantry, who aren't just gonna break ranks immediately upon contact and start carrying out their own crazy plans that usually involve death-defying stunts. Now, worse could also mean something a bit more serious, like, the actual degradation of DNA, which can lead to, diseases like cancer. And that's because our DNA is essentially the blueprint for our entire body. Our cells need instruction from DNA to create the proper proteins in order to replace the dying cells in our body. That's why radiation exposure is so dangerous. Without the proper instructions, our cells can't rebuild our bodies. And, we are just constantly dying. And real death only comes when our body's ability to repair itself is no longer efficient enough. Now, we don't see that level of degradation in the clones, but anecdotally, there are definitely some signs when we look at individuals in each generation of clones. The original, or Generation 1 of the Jango Fett clones, are probably the purest specimen that we can find. This is Captain Rex's generation. That includes Commander Cody, Commander Fox, Cutler Queen, and Captain Keeley. These are all clones who are very competent and high-achieving in their own ways. Captain Rex was not only a fantastic soldier, but he also managed to have a terrific moral compass. No doubt this had to do a lot with who his commander was, but also there's no denying that he is also as close to the perfect clone trooper as humanly possible. Then you have individuals like Commander Cody. He might exhibit a completely different personality, but he also is extremely competent in his own way. He also defected from the Empire voluntarily, which is not only a sign of high moral integrity, but also intelligence. After witnessing the chaotic execution of a separatist leader who he had promised to spare, Commander Cody realized that he was working for a chaotic organization of ass clowns that put vindictive, undisciplined, and just straight up incompetent individuals in command positions. Following fools like that into combat is the quickest way to die. Then we have Cutler Queen, whom many might see as a failure of a clone, but if you listen to his dialogue with Captain Rex when the two meet on Select Mai, he is wise beyond his years. He's found peace in a life devoted not to serving the Republic, but a family of his own choosing, a far more rational and fulfilling path in life. The world would definitely be a better place if more people had Cut's wisdom. And Commander Wolf, despite his tough and rugged demeanor, also had a really solid head on his shoulders, which is why when Captain Rex appeals to him to let his clone undergun go, Wolf makes the right move and puts loyalty to his brothers over the Empire. A decision I'm sure will help him out one day. Now, if we move on to the next generation, which is what Domino's squad is a part of, they're basically a year or so behind that first generation. You can already see that these clones are exhibiting more extreme behavior. Echo is fanatic about following orders and making sure he's doing things properly. You could almost say that he's obsessive in how he acts. Don't get me wrong, I love Echo. Seeing him return in the Bad Batch was like being reunited with an old friend. But what he did during the Citadel rescue mission, while heroic, was kind of unnecessary and a bit stupid in my opinion. And if we take a look at fellow Bad Batcher Fives, he also had some of the same problems. Fives was an emotional person. He's not exactly in control of what's going on at all times, and so when the entire inhibitor chip fiasco happens, his raw emotions, which are on full display for Shaak Ti to see, harmed his image and made it tougher for him to tell his side of the story. And again, I'm not saying that Fives is a bad soldier. He's a great soldier. He's also extremely intelligent. You have to be to uncover this clone inhibitor chip conspiracy. But his violence towards Nala Se, which shows us that he has a good read on people, ultimately was detrimental. He really did lack control in some key moments, and this really hurt him. That's exactly what happened to Echo as well. And if we take a look at the rest of the Fives in Echo's squad, we have Heavy, Cut Up, and Droidbait. Cut Up and Droidbait both died during the Rishi outpost attack, as did Heavy, who ultimately sacrificed himself. But if we take a look at Heavy, before he became a team player, when he was a clone cadet, he really had some issues. He was arrogant, he wasn't a good team player, and he believed that he alone was capable enough to finish the mission. Again, this is not something you want with your clone troopers, and this could be a sign of the Fett DNA degrading further. The last batch of clones would join the 501st during the Umbara campaign in 20 BBY. Amongst those numbers would be Clone Trooper Tup and Clone Trooper Dogma. Clone Trooper Dogma, in many ways, was an even more extreme version of Echo. He followed rules as if his life depended on it, which, of course, is where his nickname comes from. He actively supported General Ponkrell, even when it became clear that the general cared very little for the well-being of the clones and had very little respect for their lives. Dogma would even eagerly participate in the execution of Fives and Jesse after they disobeyed orders and took Umbaran ships into orbit to destroy a separate supply ship. This was a heroic act that would help change the course of the conflict. But all Dogma saw was someone threatening his rule-based reality. It was only after it was revealed that Ponkrell had orchestrated a mass friendly fire incident between the 501st and the 212th Attack Battalion that Dogma would finally understand who Ponkrell was. At which point, he would go from one extreme to another and gun down the Jedi General in cold blood. Then we had the case of Tup, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. He was an outstanding clone soldier, but the organic inhibitor chip in his brain experienced degradation in a similar way to cancer. This would cause Tup to carry out Order 66 prematurely. This in many ways is an even more extreme example of DNA degradation that Lama Su was talking about. And then, of course, we have the last generation of regular clones, which we see in the first season of the Bad Batch. Not only do these clones seem to lack any individuality, they are also cruel and bully the Bad Batch for being different, a clear sign of lower intelligence. Anyway, this is a really interesting phenomenon I guess I never really thought about. But it seems like even if the Empire had kept the clone troopers around without either Omega or Boba Fett's living DNA, it's very likely that the clones, within a few generations, would harbor even more noticeable negative attributes. Eventually, this would even lead to physical deformities, like with what we see with Clone 99. Even though his mind was clear and he's more than willing to do his part for the GAR, his body's deformities are a clear sign of what happens when the fundamental blueprint of our bodies begin to decay.